It's a great honour and pleasure in this role to be able to invite the Tawney lecturer. This lecture, a keynote of the conference, and named of course after R.H. Tawney, is an opportunity to showcase major research in new directions and allow a subject leader to present to our conference. And we certainly have a subject leader today. Our speaker today is Professor Guido Alfani, Professor of Economic History at Bocconi University in Milan. Professor Alfani, Guido, well known throughout the academic world for his research and extensive publications, of which I will say more in a moment, is a specialist in economic and social history and historical demography. As he explains on his website, my research interests include economic and social inequality, social mobility, the Italian economic trend during the early modern period, mortality crises, plagues and famines, social alliances, systems, and social networks. More recently, his attention has also turned to practices of godparenthood and name-giving, geography of customs, and the history of careers. Guido was the principal investigator of an ERC consolidator grant, social mobility and inequality across Italy and Europe from 1300 to 1800. He also previously acted as the PI of another ERC-funded project, economic inequality across Italy and Europe between 1300 and 1800, and has led or participated in a number of other major funded projects throughout his career. Guido completed his PhD in economic and social history in 2003 and rose through a series of appointments at Bocconi to become a full professor in 2018. He has held a dazzling range of visiting fellowships and various other forms of association. Presently an affiliated scholar of the Stone Center for Research on Wealth, Inequality and Mobility at Chicago, a fellow of the World Inequality Database at Paris, a research associate at the Center for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy at Warwick, a research fellow for the Center for Economic Policy and Research at London, as well as a fellow of the Dondana Center for Research on Social Dynamics at Milan, and an affiliate of the Innocenzo Gasparini Institute for Economic Research, also in Milan. He has also previously held visiting fellowships at TCD, at LSE, Utrecht, Nuffield College, Oxford, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales at Paris, Sorbonne, Paris 4, Campop, Bordeaux, and Umeå University in Sweden. His work has been recognized widely, with, alongside the associations I've already mentioned, an array of prizes and invitations to speak about his work. He has published 5 major monographs, edited or co-edited over a dozen more, and through his almost 60 peer-reviewed articles in leading journals, has made a major contribution to our discipline. His most recent publications in the last couple of years illustrate the persistence of themes that have defined his research career, including single-authored and co-authored articles on long-term trends in income and wealth inequality in southern Italy, and on poverty, inequality, and inequality extraction, looking at Germany from the Black Death until the beginning of industrialization, both of which appeared in Explorations in Economic History, as well as long-run views of inequality in history in the Journal of Economic Surveys, and on pandemics and socioeconomic status, published in Population Studies, and using evidence from the plague of 1630 in northern Italy. I first encountered Guido's work when reading on famine and also on poverty and inequality. I was straight away impressed by his confident control of his material and the highly effective drawing together of close research with a deeply informed grasp of the issues. He returns often to questions that have defined his career, but sets them in new contexts or tests them against new evidence or techniques. Take, for instance, Guido's co-authored article with Hector Garcia Montero on wealth inequality in pre-industrial England, a long-term view from the late 13th to the 16th centuries, published in Economic History Review in 2022, which offers a significant step forward, and this from an English medievalist perspective, in considering the opportunities that taxation data might offer historians of relative wealth across a broad period. The distillation of his views are to be found in his recent major books. In the lion's share, Inequality and the Rise of the Fiscal State in Pre-Industrial Europe, published by Cambridge in 2019 and co-authored with Matteo De Tullio, the authors employ archival sources from the Venetian terra firma placed alongside other European evidence in order to examine the rise of the fiscal military state and its implications for economic inequality in the early modern period, detecting a direct and positive relationship between the two. And most recently, Guido has written a further major work on a history of the rich in the West as gods among men. This excellent book displays that familiar deftness of touch to which I alluded earlier, allying narratives of wealth alongside carefully constructed analyses ranging from the Middle Ages to the present, offering reflection on what defined wealth in this period, in the past, on the ways in which wealth could be accumulated and what wealth allowed and allows the wealthy to do. As Gods Among Men is a cogent reminder of the lessons that history teaches, but also its warnings, of which I think Guido's title today, Economic Inequality and Social Mobility in Pre-Industrial Societies, What We Know, What We Don't But Should Know, we are about to hear more. Please welcome our RH Tawney lecturer for 2025, Professor Guido Alfani.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this very kind introduction. It's really a great honor to be here to deliver this Tawney lecture. Let me also acknowledge the help of the European Research Council, which funded the two projects already mentioned by Philip, which basically produced most of the data that I will show you today. Now, the idea is to provide you with a very quick overview about what we think we know now about economic inequality and the little we know about social mobility, and focus then more on what remains to be done or the additional angles that I think we would need to explore. And let me begin by recalling the fact that in his Tawney lecture delivered last year, Bas van Bavel was highlighting economic inequality as one of the research topics which, in principle, would allow economic historians to connect to some very current concerns. And in fact, I couldn't agree more with this idea. And I would even argue that the research done on the history of inequality in the last 15 years or so has changed the way in which we look at inequality today. But why? Well, the answer basically lies in this graph, if you want, which is a very simple graph. It's actually, in many respects, an oversimplified graph, but I will show you a more spatially disaggregated representation soon enough. And the point is, this graph shows the wealth share of the richest 10% in Europe from about 1300, which is as early as we can get in practice, until today. Now, let me begin by saying that by Europe, here we mean an average of Italian reunification states, and that's the red line, connected somehow boldly with Piketty's data which is a mix of information for England, France, and South Sweden. So there is exactly zero overlap in this graph. Future iterations of this, will have a more coherent territorial coverage. But let's take this as valid for now. And if we accept this, generally speaking, this graph tells us a very depressing story. So this is the graph with which I often end my presentations, and I tell the public, okay, so this is the last and most depressing thing I will show you today. I decided to begin with the worst, if you want. This is a very depressing story of economic inequality always growing, right, in the long run, exception made for periods of decline triggered by major catastrophes, the Black Death in the 14th century, and the world wars and whatever happens in between in the 20th century. Now, this depressing graph has two main interpretations. An extremely depressing interpretation, which basically argues that inequality will always grow, almost because of natural forces, and as the only way to reduce inequality is a major catastrophe, this means that the cure is worse than the illness, and we have to live with that, because nobody would want to spread a bioweapon or trigger World War III to reduce inequality, of course. My personal interpretation is a little bit more optimistic. First, there is one thing to clarify. The leveling impact of catastrophe, and of course, the most depressing interpretation is relatively close to what Walter Scheidel argued, for example, in his recent book, The Great Leveler. My interpretation is more optimistic than that offered by Walter, with which I have a constant exchange, by the way. We now also co-authored an article which was published yesterday, so we can comment on each other's work without having to agree on every point, of course. Now, the point is the following. Not all catastrophes reduce inequality. In Italy, and again, the red line here is Italy, in the 17th century, you have the worst plagues after the Black Death, killing in between 30 to 40% of the population in different areas, but you don't see anything there. And I'll go back to this when I will show you a more disaggregated version of this data. More importantly, we have to remember one thing. Human agency plays an important role in this story. First, because in the 20th century, inequality continues to decline for 20 years after World War II, and usually that is considered to be the consequence of the development of the welfare state system in the West, which was funded by means of very progressive taxation, which is introduced already from the World War period. So, also in the previous period, there is not only the destruction of financial, physical capital, so leveling, but also other factors which contribute to this decumulation of wealth at the top. But human agency plays a very important role also in explaining the early modern inequality growth, because in the book that Phil just mentioned, we argued, me and Matteo Di Tullio, that this is also the consequence of growing per capita taxation across Europe, which, by the way, is a process largely independent from what happens at the local level in terms of economic growth. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because the pre-industrial fiscal systems were regressive. So the more you tax, the more you empower those systems to produce inequality, which then accumulates, to the mechanism of savings year after year after year, pushing always inequality up. So human agency matters. And this is one, anticipating one important thing: the people behind this matter, as we will see soon enough. Now, as I promised, here I'm showing you different European regions/states. Let me begin with Italy. For Italy, I'm showing you the data about the wealth share of the richest 5% for 4 Italian reunification states: the Sabaudian state in the northwest, the Republic of Venice in the northeast, the Florentine state in the center of Italy, and the Kingdom of Naples in the south, more particularly the region Apulia. And you see that the patterns are very similar. In all these regions, taken separately, when we can go back to the Black Death period, we find inequality decline, which, by the way, we also find in South France, in other Italian regions, in all the areas where we are lucky enough to have information from before the Black Death, and right after, we find this decline. But then, in the early modern period, we find monotonic inequality growth, independently from these major plagues. The 1630 plague affecting the north plus Tuscany, nothing happens. The 1656-57 plague affecting the Kingdom of Naples, again, nothing happens. And why nothing happens? Well, because, again, human agency matters. And the Italian economic elites were not caught unaware by the 17th century plagues as they had been caught unaware at the time of the Black Death, basically. And they had introduced institutions which basically protected the patrimonies of the largest families. For example, the fideicomissum, which is a kind of entail, which made impartible, notwithstanding the system of inheritance in theory was partible to begin with, it made impartible the bulk of the patrimony of the richest families. And this is inset from before the event. So this is not leading to the same kind of patrimonial fragmentation which is triggered by the Black Death. There are other sides to the story, but for today I will not mention them. I will discuss a little bit better instead the other 2 European areas you find here. By the way, let's not forget that we have a possible exception to this idea that the Black Death was reducing inequality, and that might have been Iberia. Leandro Prados, who's there, argued that in Iberia, given the different conditions in this part of Europe, which was not very densely populated to begin with from before the Black Death, in fact, the Black Death might have led to higher inequality. But we lack information at the level of individuals or, in fact, at the level of households. So this is somehow more hypothetical, let's say. So let's allow for this possible exception. In this graph, however, the only apparent exception is that of Germany, defined here as the German area in today's boundaries. Together with Victoria Jerock and Felix Schaff, who are my co-authors for the work on Germany, we were unable to work state by state because, of course, Germany doesn't exist as a unified state before the 19th century. So we had to look for the bigger picture, but these trends for Germany are actually found at the level of each single community we could study, right? So there is really a coherence across the German area. And the point is, Germany seems to be a very different case compared to the Italian states I was mentioning. But if you look closely at the trends, the real difference is in the early 17th century, when Germany is characterized by another phase of inequality reduction, in this case really triggered by catastrophe, and that's because Germany was affected in the late 1620s by the same plague which in 1629 enters Italy, which also in Germany, as in South France, as in Central Northern Italy, was the worst after the Black Death. But on top of that, there is the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 48, the most destructive war of pre-industrial Europe, basically. So it's a combination of the most destructive war of the period and the worst plague, as far as we know, after the Black Death, which leads to this other phase of the accumulation of wealth. Because in all the other periods, in fact, the trend is similar. The fact that by the end of the 18th century, Germany seems to be more egalitarian compared to other European areas is something which has implications that remain to be explored. And this is, I think, an interesting topic for future research. And then finally, England. Now, I am bold to talk to you about England, but Phil already mentioned this. For England, we have the first two data points which come from my research with Hector Garcia Montero, and they're based on the lay subsidies for the 1327-32 data point and the Tudor subsidies for 1524-25. And the point for England is this. If you look at these two data points, the 1524-25 one is slightly higher in terms of overall inequality compared to the previous one. So, would you, be able to trace a straight line connecting the first and the second in the arguing for inequality growth in this period? I don't think so. In fact, I think that England was following a trend such as this, which is entirely hypothetical because we don't have the information to measure it. But, this would match what happens in Italy, and this also seems to be compatible with what we know about the increase of real wages in England after the Black Death, the improvement of the conditions in the rural areas. There is a criticism of the idea that the Black Death was triggering a real golden age of labor, but even those who argue in a critical way about this, like, for example, Christopher Dyer, still recognize that for the lower strata, the situation created by the Black Death was exceptionally favorable, right? So I think this is what happened, but this is an interesting period to study better and, if possible, with more data, basically. The second problem we have here is this. Now, 1524-25 is based on the lay subsidies, so it's mobile wealth. The estimates from 1630 come from Peter Linder's work, and that's basically net worth. So we have two problems. One is that the gap is 150 years long, very long, and the second is that it's not exactly the same definition of wealth. I know that people presenting at this conference, Neil Cummings, for example, are working on data allowing to cover this period better, and I think, again, that the case of England is worth of more study, including, I would say, specifically for this period, which remains relatively unexplored, also because, as you know, of the features of the English fiscal system after the Tudor subsidies, which makes the case a little bit complicated to study with this kind of records. Now, this is what remains to be done for areas that somehow we have already covered, right? But what about the rest of Europe? Luckily enough, there is much which we can still do. For at least Central and Southern Europe, we have an abundance of records such as this one, right? This is an example of an Italian estimo. It's basically a property tax record. It records taxable wealth at the household level. The minimum information we need to study inequality is, again, information about the taxable wealth of each household in a given community. As all fiscal sources of all time, these have limitations. The main one is that usually, but not always, you don't have the entire property loss being recorded. But even those who had very tiny portions of property, like, for example, a quarter of a vineyard, are included, they tend to be in between 4 and 6, 8% of the population. So not many, and it's relatively easy to adjust the estimates to also take them into account. Now, this source, the estimo in Italy, usually called estimo, is in fact very similar to what you find in much of Germany, in South France, in northeastern Spain. So we can work pretty much with the same kind of sources in a very comparative way for many areas, as we did when comparing different Italian regions with Germany, for example. And we have already, I mean, me and my research team, we have already worked on South France and Catalonia. We are still working on the paper, but that has been collected. And we have been working on other regions of Italy. The next paper we will be able to actually present is the one on Sicily. And the case of Sicily is actually very interesting because it is, in a sense, exemplary of the fact that if you really had to indicate a region of Europe where you have excellent information produced by institutions to study inequality, that's the south of Italy, right? Also Apulia, as we will see. So for Sicily, beyond having a sample of communities with the assessment of taxable wealth at the household level, we also have information about the average net wealth of all communities of Sicily at various points in time from the middle of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, which is pretty exceptional. Now, for Sicily, the assessment of taxable wealth is very comprehensive, and the same is true for Apulia. So basically that includes pretty much everything. I didn't tell you that in these sources, what is always there is real estate, so lands and buildings. Very often, in certain communities or regions, you have other items of wealth. Usually you have, well, frequently you have, for example, capitals invested in trade, but the basis, the common ground, is always real estate, which is, of course, the main component of wealth in a pre-industrial context. So much is forthcoming. There are also other groups working on other European areas. We will expand, luckily enough, the number of regions that we can compare. And as I said, the article, in this case, to expand the comparison, the sources are on our side. Where the sources aren't really on our side is when we want to move from wealth to income, because the item of direct taxation in this context is almost invariably wealth, right? So we have relatively good information about distribution of wealth for much of Europe, but we don't have good information about the distribution of income. The partial exception are the low countries, where the records are usually considered to proxy the distribution of income and not that of wealth. And I will not go into a more detailed discussion of this. Now, I was singling out South Italy as being the part of Europe with the best records in some respects. And one reason why also Apulia, beyond Sicily, has this feature is that in Apulia, as in some other parts of the kingdoms of Naples, and consider that the Kingdom of Sicily and the Kingdom of Naples were separate crowns in a personal union, so the fiscal systems are different, right? But in the Kingdom of Naples, very often you have that the communities were also taxing labor income, called industria. And this was made systematic in the middle of the 18th century by the reform of Charles VII of Bourbon. So in that period, you can really work on the distribution of income, which I think everybody would agree that ideally you would like to have at the same time the distribution of income and distribution of wealth, and when possible, the joint distribution of income and wealth, right? But again, it's very difficult to do this, and the rare exception where you can do this is, again, Apulia. Now, of course, when we talk about income, the information is somehow limited in the sense that, for example, you have what appear to be brackets of income for most of the population, and also because some incomes are not recorded. For example, the sources are not recording income of those exercising a liberal profession, so doctors, lawyers, professors at the university, right? And the reason why they aren't doing it is that it's not taxed, and it's not taxed because for those people, labor income comes from knowledge, and that knowledge is a gift of God that shouldn't be taxed, which I think is a very enlightened take on taxation, right? We all agree this is an excellent idea. We should push this also today. Not going to happen. Okay, there is no conflict of interest of any kind here. So you have to integrate that information, exploiting additional sources, of course. So there are problems, but then you have at the same time a proxy or distribution of labor income. The same source is also giving you an estimate in the same unit of measurement of capital income, because basically it comes from distribution of wealth to which a constant return rate is applied, and you can get to something like this, which is a distribution of the two components and of total income. Now, one reason why knowing more about income would be very important is that it would then allow you to use the approach of the inequality extraction ratio introduced a few years ago by Branko Milanovic, Peter Lindert, and Jeff Williamson, which basically highlights a very important point. A Gini index, which, as you know, varies in between the levels 0, so perfect equality, all households have the same, and 1, perfect inequality, all at 0, except for 1, which has everything, right? So that number doesn't tell you much about the real conditions of the society. Why is that? Well, because in the end, if you think in terms of income, what you can do is not reach a Gini level of 1, which would mean that almost everybody will starve and die, right? So you will move very soon to a perfect egalitarian society with one individual member of one household. Right? So it's unstable at the very least. And you will never get there because before getting there, society would produce a nice revolt or revolution or whatever. They will not simply wait to die. So what they argue, Milanovic and colleagues, is that what you can achieve as a maximum Gini level is that which corresponds to everybody getting subsistence and all the surplus above subsistence going in the hands of one individual or household. And then this Gini level will, of course, increase with the increase in per capita GDP because there will be more surplus, and you derive this nice curve, right? And the point is, the moment when you are able to get to an assessment of income inequality plus an assessment of per capita GDP, ideally for precisely the area that you are working on, and in the case of Italy, only now, thanks to the effort of Giovanni Federico, Michelangelo Vasta, Alessandro Nuvolari, and Federico Ridolfi, and I hope I have, Leonardo Ridolfi, and I hope I mentioned everybody, we have estimates at a more regional level, matching more or less also the Italian planification states, which actually allow to make this exercise in a bit more meaningful way, right? So the point is, when we do this, for example, in the case of Apulia, we get a case which is right at the boundary. So the point is, in the middle of the 17th century, or in the middle of the 18th century, Apulia was about as unequal as it could have been, which is interesting to know, right? It's not the case for other polities that in that period, for other societies that in that period have a comparable level of income inequality. For example, the Northern Law countries or the Dutch Republic. It's a very different context. The other virtue of this is that in principle, this approach allows to bring together two strands of research, the one on inequality and the one on per capita GDP, pushed, of course, by Steve Broadberry, but also by many others, right? And these strands of research have moved in parallel, right? And this is where they can interact with problems. To me, there are two main problems in doing this. The first is that, as you are clearly and surely aware, there is a high level of incertitude when you estimate per capita GDP, and there is a high level of incertitude when you estimate income inequality. So you're bringing together two dimensions of uncertainty. So the point is, inequality extraction ratios are very nice and cool. They have to be interpreted in a very conservative way because, again, we can try and manage the uncertainty, but there is a lot here which is potentially misleading us. And the second problem is that as these strands of research have moved in parallel, very often we don't have the coverage of the same geographic area, meaning the unit of analysis is different. For example, in the case of Italy, when I began with my projects, I was moving on a state-by-state path. So I wanted to look at regional patterns because I was aware of the fact that different Italian planification states follow a very different path, right, in terms of the economic development in the pre-industrial period. But until, again, this group led by the colleagues I was mentioning started working, we couldn't really assess inequality, we couldn't really assess estimates of per capita GDP at the same level of spatial disaggregation. So there is much here to be done, but I think this is an area in which these two strands of research should cooperate more. Now, the other interesting thing here is that this also gives us the opportunity of us addressing in a new and different way the problem of divergence within the European continent. And paradoxically, this comes from the fact that if you look at inequality trends pure and simple, the tendency is the same everywhere, with the partial exception of Germany, right? So, except for that, for all the areas for which we currently have reconstructions of inequality in the long run, you find growth in the early modern period, independently from whether the economies were growing or not. So there is actually almost no support, I would say, well, very little support for coming from pre-industrial Europe to the idea that inequality growth is some sort of negative consequence of economic growth, right? I'm really against that idea. It might happen in phases of economic growth or not, and you can't believe that economic growth could produce these monotonic trends across the board. Now, what's the problem here? These these very similar trends in inequality happen in parts of Europe which experience very different dynamics in terms of economic development in this period. That's the story of the little divergence, no? The movement, the displacement of the center of the European economy from the south, in particular from central northern Italy, to the north, beginning with the Low Countries. And which are the consequences? Well, here I'm singling out two states. First, the Florentine state, which has the characteristic of being, of all the Italian advanced economies of the late Middle Ages, the first which enters into a phase of secular stagnation, already from the beginning of the 16th century, arguably. And you see here that in the phase of stagnation, inequality growth in this polity means going straight up towards the boundary. And by the end of the period, very probably, the Tuscan society was as extractive as it could have been, again, given the constraint of allowing people to simply survive. If we compare that to the northern Low Countries, or the Dutch Republic, you see a very different story. Inequality extraction increases to a much lesser degree in the early modern period in this area. We know that the Dutch Republic is going through its golden age in the 17th century, right? So the point is you have a divergence in the levels of inequality extraction between the north and the south of Europe in this period. And this is important because when you have a society getting closer to the maximum possibility, to the maximum inequality it could achieve, the society is also becoming somehow nastier towards its individual members. And presumably, it's also becoming, a more difficult society for those who start at the bottom and would like to rise. And this leads to another problem, which is that of social mobility. Before getting there, one final point on which the research done on per capita GDP and that done on inequality could converge is on trying to use the information about the distribution of income to split the estimates of total per capita, per capita GDP into incomes in different portions of the distribution, right? I was doing this specifically for this presentation, so the first time I'm doing this. There are a number of problems that have to be addressed when you do this, but in principle, this is also something that we might want to do, and this is, again, I would say, a new area of research. Now, I was mentioning mobility. Mobility, which in practice we can measure as socio-economic mobility, is much more complicated topic to address for the pre-industrial period compared to economic inequality, and this for two reasons. First, because it's technically more difficult to address, right, for many reasons which I will not develop for reasons of time, and second, because we need more exceptional historical sources, which basically are of the same kind you can use for studying the distribution of wealth, for example, but require the additional feature of being close in time enough that you can actually connect the households across time. And if you have a time gap which is too wide, you will be unable to make this bridge. So the point is, this can be done for a subset of the areas and communities for which you can work on inequality. Here I'm showing the final data coming from a still unpublished and I would say mostly unwritten paper, but that is final, about Tuscany in the period of the Black Death. I think that this is the only region in the world for which you could really do this, right? I'm not aware of other areas for which the information available, the archival records available would allow you to do this. And what you see here is that, first let me begin by saying that here socioeconomic mobility is measured as relative mobility between quintiles of the wealth distribution. So it's a pure measure of movement, right? Was it easier or not to move across the distribution of wealth in the period after the Black Death? And what this data suggests is that, yes, it was much easier than before. You have a big boost to mobility, which then lasts for a couple of generations, and then slowly goes back to levels closer to the pre-Black Death level. Now, this is interesting because these basically are rural areas of Tuscany. We can't do this for Florence. There is a study by John Paget, and John Paget, which uses network analysis, and in particular, he looks at the establishment of new lineages within the city of Florence, and he argues that the Black Death created in the city of Florence a huge tidal wave of new families entering the elite, right? So also at the political level, this was a phase in which it was relatively easy to observe and to experience movement. Now, this is the Black Death. What's at stake here in terms of the debate? Well, this is a purely hypothetical graph, and it's exactly the same graph I was showing when I was proposing my project to the European Research Council, right? So this is not informed by the evidence collected after. And the point is, at that moment, there was one idea in the literature proposed mostly by Greg Clark, and the idea was that in the context of pre-industrial Europe, social economic mobility was pretty much low and stable in time. And my point was yes, but what about whether in fact we can observe secular trends? What if some events, like again major pandemics, can create waves in mobility? The Black Death did, right? As I showed you. Now the data for the following periods is still provisional. I'm showing you two communities. One from Lombardy and the other one from Tuscany, in which you don't see, again, at the time of the 1630 plague, you don't see a change in mobility, if not very limited and short-lived. Why is that? Well, this kind of reflects, this kind of mirrors the fact that we also don't observe a decline in inequality. The elites, the economic elites, were ready, right? They were protected against this undesired egalitization that a major catastrophe could have brought forward, in particular a major mortality crisis. But there is more to that. There is more to that, because it's not only a matter of protecting the patrimonies. In this period, the economic elites very often were also controlling the political bodies at the state and local level. So they had come to control the access to the local resources, something that has been explored, for example, by Matteo Di Tullio in a recent book. And I will go back to that topic later. The second point is that, in general, you observe in these examples a long-run tendency for a decline in socioeconomic mobility in the context of Italy, so in the south of Europe, which becomes particularly intense in the 17th century, when the little divergence really acquires strength. Of course, we would really like to know whether the situation is different in the north of Europe. The idea is to try and compare trends, and this is something that, however, remains to be done. Now, one important thing when we think about mobility is that basically we are thinking about people. We are start moving in the direction of thinking about what happens to individuals moving up and down the wealth pyramid. And the problem then becomes also asking who were these people. And I would say that there is a big area for research which has been remained a bit to the side of these 15 or even 20 years of research on inequality, which is what were the people actually doing? Who were those becoming so wealthy? Why were they able to accumulate wealth? What was their agency, right? We were referring more generally about agency before, but in practice, what were their aims? And this in my most recent book, which again Phil kindly mentioned, I tried to look specifically at this. And I tried to disentangle the main paths to affluence across Western history. I focus on 3 which I think are the main ones, plus others which play a secondary role. Beginning, of course, with the path of nobility and aristocracy. In the Middle Ages, you can easily believe that those, that the easiest way to be wealthy was to be born into wealth, belonging to a wealthy noble family. And this is the path to affluence that we tend to associate to the idea of inherited wealth. But not all these people were actually inheriting, their fortunes. There are also first generations, like Alan the Red. Alan the Red was a very minor noble from Normandy. He joined William the Conqueror in the conquest of England. He might have fought to his side at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, and then he remained, differently from many other Normans, he remained in England. He developed a specialization which was defeating rebellions against the new king. And every time he was gifted many lands from the defeated rebels, and according to a somehow fun estimate, he might have been looking at the share of the total product of the British Isles, which he could command. He might have been the richest person ever to live in Britain, right? And that's what Rubinstein, for example, suggested. But let's take this as a funny bit, which might be true or not. I'm not in the condition of judging this too much. The other point is, and this kind of is clear when we look at entrepreneurship, is also to try and disentangle the phases during which growing wealthy was relatively easy. And I'm showing here another important example from Britain, Richard Arkwright, the inventor of the water frame, one of the transformative innovations of the cotton industry during the British first industrial revolution. And Arkwright, thanks to the patents on his invention, became, in the 18th century at some point, the richest commoner of Britain. So he made a substantial fortune. The third part, that of finance, I think it has to be disentangled from entrepreneurship because this is the specific path to affluence, which in the Western tradition has tended to attract more unease and even condemnation. There is a cultural bias against finance. If we focus only specifically on the pre-industrial period, this has always been a very minority path to wealth. So very few people became wealthy through finance in this context. Interestingly, today, the path of finance as a path to affluence is arguably easier to follow than at any previous point in Western history. Now, what I wanted to tell you about this is that, first, measuring the relative prevalence of the different paths to affluence across history, in the pre-industrial period specifically, is pretty complicated, but this is also an area where there is a lot of research which could be done in the future. And the other area of research which is worthy of further exploration, I think, is trying again to precisely identify and measure the phases during which becoming wealthy has been relatively easy. The Industrial Revolution, first, of course, but also for continental Europe, mostly the Second Industrial Revolution, going backward in time, at least the beginning of the opening, at least the first phase of the opening of the Atlantic trade, and then, if we go even further back in time, the post-Black Death scenario, right? And let me tell you something about, again, the conditions created by the Black Death, focusing on one specific example, which is that of Francesco di Marco d'Attini, which me and Phil know very well because, given that we know a lot about this merchant from the 14th century, we know a lot because his almost complete personal and business archive was rediscovered in his palace in Prato in Tuscany at the end of the 19th century. So we really know everything about his affairs, almost everything. There is a yearly conference in the city of Prato, specifically on the economic history of the pre-industrial period. So, we have to attend, and also some other people here tend to attend almost every year that one. So Francesco di Marco d'Attini is relevant to this story because he was made an orphan by the Black Death. He was very young, maybe he was about 15. We aren't sure about his exact year of birth when the Black Death struck. Both his parents died. Most of his brothers and sisters died. Then, very quickly after the pandemic, he does something exceptional. He inherited something, he sold everything, raised then some capital, moved from Prato to Avignon in South France, where the papal court was based at the time, and started trading between South France and Italy. And he became extremely successful. At some point, he moved back to Florence, and there he started, establishing bases connecting Italy and Tuscany in particular with the rest of the Mediterranean and of Europe, and again, he became one of the most successful merchants of the 14th century, beginning with a relatively middling and even middling low position. So in the immediate post-Black Death scenario, not only there were new opportunities that somebody could exploit, but more importantly, the pandemic had created holes in the pre-existing hierarchies that, it could be used to clean up, doing exactly what Francesco Di Marco d'Attini did. Now, again, why in the 17th century we don't find the same thing? One possibility is that we have to look for, in certain historical phases at least, look for those who I tend to call the enemies of mobility. Here represented by 4 senators of the Republic of Venice. Poor guys, I don't know who they are, nobody does, so they could be entirely blameless, personally, but I think that visually they represent very well what I want to tell you, right? So, I was already telling you before that the turn of the 17th century is a moment when the political elites are trying to strengthen their grasp also on the public resources. Now, what's the point here? Well, the point here is the following. First of all, when I talk about the Republic of Venice, we are used to think about this patrician republic, this merchant republic, as a relatively open polity, right? This is the way in which it has been portrayed many times, including by the recent Nobel Prize in Economics. But what it means being open in this context, basically it means being open to the interests, to the requirements of the economic elite. So it's here that potentially the economic elite, which also have the political power, can twist the system to serve their needs. And the point is the following: both at the state level, so the Republic as a whole, and at the local level, if you look at the local councils, by the beginning of the 17th century, and with a different chronology in different parts of South Europe, I hypothesize somehow, you have that in the face of declining economic perspectives, expectations, because they were, they realized that competition from North Europe was kind of compromising their ability to control trade and to control the European and Mediterranean market for certain other products, right? So they started to think in a different way, to defend their position. So they, for example, displaced part of their investment in trade and manufacture towards land, which also has the consequence, again, of pushing up wealth inequality, because, again, you have the richest start to competing more aggressively on the land market, if you want, and they strengthen their control also over the public resources. And how they do this, if you look at the statutes of single communities between the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, they start introducing rules that require that in order to be able to have somebody representing, to have a family member in the local councils, those, you have to have been a member of the council also in the past. So the idea is to reserve the membership of the main political bodies at the local level to the families that already hold that power in the previous period, right? Making this somehow hereditary. And again, the reason why they're doing this is that potentially the control of the local resources is valuable. It also gives you leverage in a number of other ways. And the moment you observe a decline in the general economic opportunities, you start looking at what you can more or less control very directly. Now, to follow along these lines, let me tell you another story, which is the story of the Medici family in Florence. The Medici family is another example of a family which was able to rise, exploiting the opportunities created by the Black Death in the 14th century. In the 14th century, in Florence, they were newcomers. They weren't originally from Florence. Now, the moment when the family really rises to power, and of course, they became very wealthy, acting as bankers, but the moment when they really rise to power is with Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo the Elder. And here there is an interesting story. In 1433, Cosimo de' Medici was exiled from Florence, charged with intending to rise above the other citizens. So the idea was, this guy, who possibly was the richest person in Florence in that moment, wants to upturn the republican institutions. So they exile him. Problem is, the following year, Florence loses a war over the control of Lucca and risks going bankrupt because they can't repay the war loan with the spoils of war, as they lost. How to solve the problem? Well, simple. They exile the political enemies of Cosimo, call him back, and beg him to please save the state from financial collapse, which he does, ordering to his bank of buying the debt of the city, right? And from this moment, he also starts investing in the city in great deeds, what a humanist from the late 15th century, Giovanni Pontano, qualified as magnificence, which basically means to do great deeds, right? Etymologically, it means to do great deeds. And he argued, in our age, so the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici was the first to renew this ancient tradition from the classical period. And what was magnificence for Pontano? Well, it was basically a way of converting private wealth into a public benefit. And he said, even if a rich only builds his private palace in a city, so you can't get in because it's private, right? But you can still walk by and enjoy it aesthetically from the outside. And those who come to your city, I'll make a point soon enough. Those who come to your city will see these palaces, and they will think better of the city and of those who live there, right? Now, it seems strange, but what does it mean to walk by along the streets of Florence or of Venice or of any other well-preserved city of the European Renaissance today, right? We still enjoy these private buildings. And if instead of doing this, you establish a public library, like Cosimo did, he established the first part of the Medici Library, which is usually considered to have been the first public library of Renaissance Europe. Or if you endow a monastery, it's even better. So, was Cosimo de' Medici magnificent in this sense? Sure he was. And the buildings he had erected, many of them are still there, and they are museums today. Right? So the idea kind of stands. But what's the actual meaning of magnificence? Now, here you have a painting, which actually it's a fresco, and I love it. It's the Procession of the Magi, the Three Kings, by Benozzo Gozzoli, 15th century. Right? So the three kings are bringing gifts to baby Jesus. Great. Interestingly, members of the Medici family are portrayed as the kings. Lawrence the Magnificent, the grandchild of Cosimo, very young at the time, portrayed as Caspar here. And something I discovered only recently is that actually the Medici family at Epiphany regularly organized procession along the roads of Florence in which they were dressed as the kings. Also, before discovering this, I was usually presenting this painting to suggest that we should be a bit wary of the super rich when they give us gifts, and giving, I think, is an important keyword here, right? And the problem is, this is not a gift, right? Magnificence is not munificence. Munificence means to make a gift. Magnificence means to do great things. And if we look at the classical tradition, right, and if you think, for example, at the Greek philosopher Plato, Plato argued that magnificence was one of the virtues that had to be possessed by the philosopher king. So it's a virtue of a ruler. And 1434 is also the moment when the historians place the beginning of the so-called hidden seigneury of the Medici family in Florence. Let's go back to the data proposed by John Paget. These are new families entering the Florentine elite from the immediate post-Black Death period till the end of the 15th century, right? You see the wave, the tidal wave, as he said, of new families entering the elite right after the Black Death. And here you see the establishment of the Medici rule over Florence. Another indicator of very declining social mobility, because at that point, if you wanted to belong to the elite, you had to be close to the Medici. There was no other way, and nobody else was able to make it from the bottom to the top without accepting the de facto rule of the Medici. So, let's add another bit of history. As I was telling you before, of the most advanced areas of 15th century Italy, Tuscany was also, from the following century, the first to enter a phase of secular stagnation. So, the story of the rise of the Medici family is also the story of the super rich in a polity acquiring the control of the local institutions, controlling government. The descendants of Cosimo will become formally the Dukes of Florence and the Dukes of Tuscany, Grand Dukes of Tuscany, and so on. And the area, their country, is starting to experience secular stagnation, which I think goes against the idea that if you have the super rich in power, you can expect that they will provide for everybody. History will tell you they will tend to provide primarily for themselves. Then whether this will repeat or not, we don't know. Of course, if you think that by talking to you about the Medici in the 15th century, I am trying to do what Bas van Bavel argued you could do, so use history to talk about today, well, you would be entirely correct, but I will stop here and thank you for your attention.